welcome everyone to this webinar about regenerative landscapes. My name is Marc Sherratt and I'll be your facilitator for today. So, welcome, and who are we? The Regenerative Collaborative is a non-profit organization focused on transforming our built environment into a regenerative one. We promote strategies and approaches that bring regenerative design and construction to life. We work collectively to inspire, educate, and create awareness and contextualize regenerative built environment approaches to the South African context. We really focus on local projects, local people, and local companies to showcase all the good things that are happening in this space in South Africa. So as I mentioned, all our webinars are recorded and uploaded onto YouTube, so you can find a lot more topics there if you're interested to rewatch one of these. And if you want to become a sponsor of our webinar or know a company want to sponsor this, please let us know as well. We're always interested in getting sponsors on board and people that are aligned with our vision to support us. And then a call for you all to follow us on our social media, on our YouTube or LinkedIn page, as well as on our Eventbrite, which is our registration platform. It really helps us if you like us and follow us on one of these platforms. And then a call for volunteers. As I mentioned, it's a non-profit organization and we are working with volunteers from anywhere. So even if you don't know much about the topic, it doesn't matter. We can still use your help, especially on the admin and social media side. So from our last webinar, we've got a new member to the team. So that's very exciting, and I hope that we can get another person joining our team soon. So yeah, today we're speaking about regenerative landscapes. We're speaking about regenerative landscapes in South Africa, and we will explore the transformative impact of permaculture and that positive operational ecology. We're going to showcase how these approaches can advance sustainable land use and ecological restoration. All right, and then today I found this article was shared with me and I thought it was quite useful for today's webinar. A really nice article about the natural heritage and reviving the Cape Flats endangered botanical biodiversity species and landscapes in the Daily Maverick. That was a very good read, so I thought it was quite appropriate for this webinar. But over to the order of the day. I'm going to introduce Marc. He is a very good colleague of ours, and I'm really happy to have him here back on our webinar. He is celebrated by the Mail and Guardian as one of the South Africa's 200 young visionaries. And Marc is an award-winning architect and net zero accredited professional that started his own practice, MSSA, Marc Sherratt Sustainable Architecture, in 2017. He has grown this practice into an industry leader that's on sustainable architecture, and he's worked on some of the most pioneering green buildings in South Africa. He holds a master's in architecture and from the University of Johannesburg and is currently busy with his second master's in sustainability at the University of Cambridge. So really happy to have him here and to start talking about net zero ecology. He's going to present one of the projects that we collaborated on in Johannesburg. So I'm really keen. I know he's an amazing speaker, so he will definitely entertain you for the coming 40 odd minutes or so. So Marc, I will stop sharing and give you the floor.
Brilliant. Thanks, Marlies, and welcome to everyone. I'm always very excited to share the work we're doing as a practice. Okay, great. So I'm not a landscape architect. I'm an architect by training. But what I will kind of take you through today is just the journey that we've been on as a practice. And we feel quite strongly that landscape design, landscape architecture is critical in our fight against climate change, our fight against urbanization and local extinction in cities. And we're going to take you into kind of the back house kitchen side of how we produce our designs and where they come from. And this this word inquilinism is one of the few words that we've been able to find that tries to describe what we're trying to do in the long term as a practice. So inquilinism comes from ecological science, where symbiotic relationship between two species where one uses the other as its home. So a bird building its nest within a tree would be a form of inquilinism. And the question we're really asking as a practice is, how could we do that within cities? How do we do that within our buildings, where our wild species could be considered an equal client in the design or operation of a space alongside its human residents? And then if you take our purpose statement, which is reversing local extinction through sustainable architecture, which is kind of one sentence to describe what we're doing, we're seeing kind of two extinctions happen across the African continent. One is natural extinction, as we're well aware, with cities growing. But the other one is also cultural extinction, languages, African languages disappearing, African ways of building disappearing. So could we highlight these two aspects of extinction and try and build bridges between them, as well as reflect them in a more contemporary light? And as you can see, we've started to define what that means in terms of kind of performance standards for sustainability around buildings, and landscaping design being an important part of that. So some of my background, as Marlies mentioned, studied at UJ. I worked for a practice called Mashibane Rose Associates for 3 years, and then the practice has been running for 7 years. And now for my sins, doing another master's in sustainability. But what was wonderful about my experience at Mashibane Rose was they focused a lot on heritage buildings, and the sensitivity in which you approach a heritage building is quite similar to the way you approach an ecologically sensitive site. So I could learn a lot about those approaches in buildings, as well as work on quite large scale buildings between 20 and 60 million rand for mainly public sector clients, from museums, public transport systems, theaters. And then, as most architectural practices, we started trying to win competitions globally. This is one of our finalist museums for a museum in Ireland, which we did. And then since starting the practice, we've been able to help South Africa define kind of the first of its kind in the Green Building Council's net zero rating. Net zero basically means that you're trying to do no harm to the environment in a certain category. There's 4 categories. One looks at carbon emissions related to climate change and energy use. One looks at water, one looks at waste, and one looks at ecology. And we've been able to define best practice standards for South Africa, using architecture and using these net zero green building rating systems as a performance benchmark to say, okay, this is actually what sustainability means, and this is what it means when you're not doing any harm in a certain environment. These are some of the projects that we've produced over the last couple of years that have achieved net zero. And what we're going to be speaking about today is net positive ecology. Net positive is actually when you're doing something good now. You're not trying to do no harm. You're actually trying to regenerate or heal or restore the land, which is, again, what we're focusing on today. I need to do justice if there are people in the room that aren't familiar with kind of the latest climate science of what's happening in Southern Africa. That's a big driver to why we have, really try to focus on sustainability within the practice. But there is a direct link, as we know, undisputed in science now, between greenhouse gas emissions and the increase in surface temperature that we are experiencing over the last 30, 40 years now. And we've all seen these maps of trying to live within the 1.5 degree or 2 degree warming potential that the Paris Agreement gives us. But a more important term is the term drawdown, where we start to bend this curve downwards. Where do we get to a point where we start to remove this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, that we're starting to see a reduction? And basically the mission is quite simple. We need to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. You can see 30 to 40% of CO2 emissions is generated by the building industry. We need to support the sinks, these amazing natural systems that remove carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And then we need to improve society. We've seen, as we educate women, as we uplift people, give them choice, give them education, you can actually lower their carbon footprint. And then the other side of the kind of climate science that's become clearer in the last kind of 20, 30 years is we're starting to understand how the Earth operates. These are kind of the 9 planetary boundaries, where everything outside of the safe operating space, everything that's shown here in kind of orange and red, are things that we've we've kind of crossed a threshold, crossed the dangerous threshold, and these systems are kind of interconnected. That one starts failing, the other starts failing, and you see kind of significant collapse across the planet. So this at least has given us some kind of focus area. And if you think about the built environment, we're dealing with land system change, we're dealing with biosphere integrity, we're dealing with climate change, we're dealing with pollution, which is novel entities. The built environment covers a lot of these spaces. So, where we invest our money in terms of cities, and specifically Africa, when you're talking about the new cities that we're going to be building in the next 20 to 30 years, we have an opportunity as South Africans to kind of lead the world in kind of best practice green thinking within the architectural space. But the important thing is not to just focus on the environment. The important thing is to balance that within kind of the real, the social side. It has to be balanced. We can't solve the environmental side and not be looking at the social side at the same time. So how will that affect us within Southern Africa? You're looking at about, if we don't do anything, we're looking at about a 5-degree increase in the next 100 years over kind of the hottest parts of the subcontinent. So places like Namibia, Botswana getting much drier. The rainfall, it kind of depends on where in Africa you're sitting. You can see Lesotho gets kind of a little bit more rainfall. But obviously this is averages. So think about what this means for specific weather events. We've already seen kind of extreme weather events, and my industry and the engineering industry is pretty worried when we design buildings based on looking back over 100-year floodplains or those kind of, metrics where the storms are actually increasing. So our waterproofing detail and everything else is increasing because we are very unsure in terms of how violent these storms can get. And then as a country, this is what most of our greenhouse gases that are generated are CO2, carbon dioxide, mainly from our energy industry. So the way that we produce electricity, as we know, coal-fired power stations is the majority. But again, the upstream use or downstream use of energy is within buildings. So there's a massive opportunity for us to look at buildings. But then what are these aspects around, taking this carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases outside of the atmosphere? Sure, we can reduce the sources, but still there's so much of this greenhouse gas emissions already within the atmosphere. Land sinks and vegetation is one of the most effective ways to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this is everything below the line here in blue is our forestry land actually absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere and creating a land sink. And as you can see over time, you're seeing farmers kind of move their monocrop farming techniques to grassland for more kind of cattle feed. And we're seeing an increase in grassland. And the interesting thing between forest and grassland is forests are storing the carbon, a lot of it in the tree. So about half the weight of dry weight timber is pure carbon, where grasslands are storing the carbon within the soil itself. And the plant has this amazing symbiotic relationship with fungi and bacteria within the soil and actually exchanges the carbon within that network. So if you cut the grass, the carbon is still within the soil, but if you cut the trees, the carbon is lost, which is quite interesting. And then our critically endangered and endangered biomes, those are also the biomes that provide us the greatest opportunity as we restore them and rewild them and regenerate them, and providing us opportunities for carbon sequestration in the long term. So again, these systems are connected. So how we've tried to explain this to clients is to put our biomes on a map and just show clients what's going to be changing over the next 20, 30 years. So if you take the grassland biome, which is this big yellow space, and we're seeing that shrinking to around mainly the Lesotho area, you're seeing the Namib Desert come into the Karoo, and you're seeing the Kalahari spread across savanna, bushveld biome in the north and across the grassland biome. Grassland biome is where we're sitting in Johannesburg is the second most biodiverse biome after Fynbos. So think about what that does from a biodiversity point of view. And a lot of the R&D that we've done as a practice is to get out into these kind of pristine ecological spaces, study the rural people that live in these places and learn from them. So from the deserts in Namibia to the Okavango Delta in Botswana to the mountains of Lesotho, we are seeing this change from grassland to a dry savanna and from the Karoo to a hardcore desert. And extinction is not just land-based. This is our team taking an uncaged shark dive, really trying to understand one of the most misunderstood predators on the planet. We're seeing even predators becoming endangered, things that we take for granted as Africans, lions, elephants, leopards are becoming more and more endangered within our lifetime. And so a lot of our work is around what are sustainable building materials? This is Drakensberg bamboo, so a specific species of bamboo found in Lesotho that the Lesotho use in their building techniques. Is this a form of sustainable building material? Grassland needs to be cut, it needs to be eaten. It can't just be left. It's been designed to be burnt. Is this a sustainable form of building material? And then this is some of the work that we're doing in Zambia at the moment with just the massive, I don't know what the right word is, but a lot of their forests are being cut down and exported into the Asian markets. This is rosewood, which is one of the most beautiful hardwoods that you get in the world, seized from illegal logging. Is this a beautiful material? Is this a sustainable material? Should we be using this or should we not? So yeah, really interesting questions. And the stories around these areas are fascinating. This is a village in Wakkerstroom that protects a certain area of grassland because they allow their cattle to graze it. And because this grassland is grazed, they have this endangered bird where people come from all over the world to see because it's only found here and nowhere else in the world. So the interesting conversations around food, should we be eating meat? Should we be removing meat completely from our diet? What happened if this community removed cattle, for example? This grassland would not function in a way that allows this bird to thrive. So these are interesting questions that we need to ask ourselves. And then again, just celebrating the incredible biodiversity we have as a country. Sandby talks about us as the third most biodiverse country in the world. So starting to document the beauty of these species, how can we translate these things into the spaces we live in, that we can educate people around how special our fauna and our flora is. For example, this succulent, if you think about it as a building, it's got a skylight at the top and it's chloroplasts or solar panels on the inside of the plant. So again, getting light through the roof rather than through the window, obviously then you don't have to worry about things like orientation, and then allowing your solar panels to be inside so they're not full of dust. Could this be an example for a building type? So this is our process. We get inspired by nature. How does nature build things? How does nature make space? How does nature use local materials? Adding something poetic around African culture. This is one of the percussion instruments within the Rwanda area, and translating that into a building. This is a competition submission we did for a chapel in Rwanda that honored the genocide in a way that the building sings and creates sound, these kind of eerie sounds during different weather events, depending on where the wind is blowing. And using exotic species to actually make this building, and the materiality is kind of these cloths, these silk cloths and timber, similar to how the bagworm makes its enclosure. And then how do we apply this to the city? So if you think about the city of Johannesburg, very young city compared to our kind of European and Western rivals. So that means that the ecological system is still intact to some degree. You still get brown hyena getting lost up the Yixkay. You still get, spotted genet, involved in the urban forest. So you drive an hour, 2 hours outside of Joburg and you could be in a pristine ecological system. Johannesburg, as we know, sits within the grassland biome, but also since we've been here, we've planted one of the largest man-made forests in the world. So we've started to quantify the size of this forest. We're looking at about 400 square kilometers and starting to do calculations on how much carbon does this forest actually, store for the city. Can that be interrogated into the city's climate action plans? Our critical biodiversity areas within the city, these red areas, which are generally grassland environments, how do we protect these? How do we design architecture for a climate resilient future? An example of Johannesburg is that because we've planted this forest, we've changed the microclimate of the city compared to surrounding farmlands that are 4 degrees colder in winter. And so we've started to give these kind of goals. What do we do with the mine dumps? What do we do with our north flowing river systems? The red line is the watershed line that moves through the city of Joburg. So every drop of rain that falls to the north flows to the Indian Ocean. Every drop of rain that falls to the south flows to the Atlantic Ocean. What do we do with places like Soweto, in terms of using trees that can reduce urban heat island? And how do we connect our critical biodiversity areas with wildlife corridors? How could they link to World Heritage sites? Maybe all our tourism spots in the province are linked with wildlife and landscape being the core linkage to do that. And then how do we give guidance to landscape architects? If you find yourself in the northern suburbs, why are you not planting species from Igoli granite grassland, which is the original vegetation type of that specific area and is critically endangered? And then a lot of our R&D projects are kind of focused on very difficult implementation points. So how do we do that within Alexandra Township? How do we restore a north flowing river system? How do we bring back the mine dumps to some kind of ecological functionality? That's what these numbers relate to, and we'll go through some of our precedents to show that today. So let me talk about Vermoenig. It's South Africa's first net positive ecology project. The first thing is to talk about when you're designing any kind of net zero project is to make sure you've got an integrated design process. So you're performance orientated. You're not just looking at the aesthetics of the landscaping. You're looking at how it performs. So you're setting those targets up front to your client. So net positive ecology is a performance target for the design, not just pretty plants that we can maintain. Understanding the local weather is pretty self-explanatory. And then making sure, the important thing on this landscape project is making sure that when we handed over the landscaping project, that the team that was going to maintain it was trained to do that. A lot of these projects look wonderful in the first couple of years, and then, after 5 years, everything's falling apart. So our appointment at the moment is to monitor biodiversity for the next 5 years now that we've implemented this landscaping project, but that training aspect was critically important. So what made this project special is it brought back Igoli granite grassland, which is a critically endangered vegetation type, the most endangered vegetation type in the city of Johannesburg. We planted over 137 different species, over 4,000 individual plants. And it's been quite a wonderful example of just what you can do with a relatively small budget, but a really committed professional team and client. This is the map that we've helped SAMBI produce. We produced this map for all the 5 major cities across the country so that landscape architects and landscape designers know what vegetation type was originally there, what species list is linked to that, and how endangered each of those vegetation types are. So we can start to get excited living in a city and contributing to conservation in a small way. The site itself is 1,500 square meters that we actually regenerated, about 15% of the site being about 10,000 square meters. This is the technical ecology calculator that you fill out in order to prove that you are net positive ecology. You're looking at about a 6-point change between your site, before you actually implemented the landscaping compared to after that. So you can see this is what we gained for our project itself. And then the project site, the existing photos show the existing Kikuyu lawn in a winter and a summer condition. And obviously our approach was to remove that lawn being an exotic species and very difficult to get rid of, and then replant with locally indigenous species. We did keep a memory of the lawn, but also keep the client vigilant in being able to maintain the landscape. You can't just let this Kikuyu do whatever it wants. It will get in and start to take over. And then from a technical point of view, we researched the vegetation composition ratio of Igoli granite grassland. So the ratio between grass, herb, geophytes, small trees, tall shrubs, and tried to match that as closely as possible to what we planted. So what's important about this is not just planting a grass that looks pretty or a whole bunch of different species. It's the relationship between these plant types. Every plant type between a grass and a herb has a different ecological function. And you want to try and match those relationships as close as possible. And the important one for this one is the relationship between grass and herb being kind of a 2-to-1 ratio. That's what we tried to do with what we planted. We planted a lot more geophytes than the percentage of existing Igoli granite grassland, and that's because most of the locally indigenous plants we could ethically source were geophytes. So people love the pretty flowers. A lot of those are bulbs. This is just the same graph represented in a different way. So original, what we planted in terms of the amount of species. And then also monitoring that. So monitoring that in 2023, a year after the landscape had been planted, monitoring that this year, 2 years after the landscape is being planted, and making sure that these species are still surviving. And this ratio is still kept as close as possible to the original. And then net zero ecology or net positive ecology, not just looking at plants. How do we increase insect biodiversity? So these are the signage that illustrated the scent and smell plants of the landscape that we planted. The client is a scent and fragrance manufacturer. And then putting insect hotels behind that. So pieces of wood with some holes drilled in them at very specific sizes to attract very specific species to pollinate the landscape. And then the other kind of biodiversity metric or smart goal that we set for ourselves is to triple breeding bird diversity in 5 years. So it's one thing to bring birds back, which we've seen a kind of 10 to 20% increase in bird species that we've seen on site. But there's something different when you provide, again, the home for the bird. The bird actually chooses the landscape to breed, the most precious aspect of its lifespan, bringing up kids. We think what that means for us. So what we did is we took our current bird list of what we saw, what we'd seen on site, and we took what habitat requirements were needed for those birds on the left-hand side of the graph, and provide as much of that in the short term as possible. So there's very simple things, putting up nesting locks, putting up owl boxes, and then to look at the area list of bird species and seeing if we could provide those habitats within the grassland. So you can see bare ground, short grass, tall grass, short dense grass, important for the area bird species. And that related directly into how we maintain the landscape. So to make sure that we're not cutting, you have to cut grassland once a year for it to stay healthy, that we're not just going to cut all the grass at the same time. We're going to choose specific areas to cut in the early season, certain areas to cut in the late season, so that you've always got this relationship between short and tall grass. And we originally had already designed a bare area in the middle. So trying to create as much habitat flexibility as possible between the different types of grasses. And then some good and some bad news, just being honest in terms of the successes and the failures of the project. So we had one breeding bird species on site already. This is common fiscal that flew into the reflective glass of the building and died. So we started at -1, if you want to call it that, in terms of breeding bird diversity. We have seen Cape sparrows now come back. So we're now at kind of a net zero when it comes to breeding bird diversity. But this is important. This is important to tell the client. We've got this amazing landscaping, but there's failures in the building in terms of, the building kind of killing that landscaping or the species of that landscaping in the process. And then this was a recent photo actually last week. We're busy taking soil samples to measure carbon sequestration of the landscape. And we found these droppings of what we think are grassland mice. And now because of the client being aware of this, they're changing their whole pesticide regime from poison-based chemicals to non-poison-based rodent trappings. Obviously, we don't want rodents in the building, especially making food and scent and that sort of manufacturing process. But this kind of, the client seeing the landscape as precious and making sure that they're taking advantage of that. I'll go through a couple of other precedents quite quickly. So this is our micro-housing unit that we applied for Alexandra Township. This is talking about our massive problem with housing that no one seems to be able to solve. And this is about a 2-year community-led design process that took fire as the most difficult problem to solve from an architectural point of view, researching how fire is, used as an ecological device within grasslands, finding these, again, hero species that are adapted to fire and translating that into a building. This is where the building is designed to be placed using materials like CLT that actually has a very good fire resistance record, only kind of 1 millimeter a minute. So, you're at 100 millimeters or 200 millimeters, you're getting your 2-hour fire rating. And then thinking about the ecological system cladding the building. So how do we bring locally fruiting plants that people can, stankvrucht milk plum, you can make into brandy, you can make into a whole bunch of commercially orientated products, designing that as part of the green walls around the building, apiculture, which is the harvesting of honey, wild jasmine, what that does for scent and pollinators. So trying to define sustainability from a microeconomic point of view, that the building is creating resources, creating finances for the people that live within it, not just, an expense thing in terms of maintenance. And again, obviously the building protecting itself from fire. If we move up a scale, looking at the Vleyhuis residential development, which is a high-end housing development in Linden, the approach was to design the landscaping first and insert the buildings afterwards, similar to how a bird would build its space or its nest within a landscape. Choosing a wetland because it provides 2 degrees cooling, evaporative cooling. If you remember, Johannesburg is going to be getting 2 degrees warmer. So using landscape as a climate resilient device. And then also thinking in terms of security. So thinking about a bird, raising its nest above the water level, camouflaging its nest. Can we use those strategies in terms of our approach to security instead of building a high wall with some security fencing? So the wetland moves underneath the buildings. The water system is completely integrated into the building. So all your drinking water comes from this wetland that treats water to drinking quality. Again, there's a climatic aspect to the wetland, providing moist and fresh air that moves through the building. And the wetland was a wonderful kind of success intervention for us that we made sure we understood using an expedition trip to the Okavango Delta in Botswana, understand how the Tswana use wetlands, how biodiverse a wetland can be. So this wetland is our rainwater storage device. It treats that water to drinking quality and then also provides food. So the potential for aquaculture as well as urban farming on the roof. And again, using our roof spaces for landscapes. It's just such an underutilized option in South Africa or even in Johannesburg. Our roofs are generally empty. And this project was able to get triple net zero. So not just one net zero category, but looking at the net positive, the solution of the wetland was what helped us gain the net zero water, which means that everything is on a renewable source without having to use kind of really ugly JoJo tanks for storage. And then we've, again, started to implement the landscaping first. So instead of, your typical property development approach of destroying the landscaping and then bringing in the building and every kind of leftover spaces for the grassland or whatever you're planting, let's design the landscaping and implement the landscaping first, and then sensitively insert the architecture afterwards. How would we have to change the way we construct buildings in order to do this? And this is quite an interesting story, because as we brought this landscaping back, we've seen people litter more in this landscaping than the typical green lawns that you see in the area. So there's just a lack of appreciation for how endangered this space is, how more biodiverse it is compared to your Kikuyu lawn. But what was a wonderful experience is when we saw those brown-veined whites, those white butterflies that moved across the city, they all came to rest in this grassland and nowhere else. So again, when you walked past, you felt the biodiversity increase just because you've used locally indigenous species that other species can identify with. If we look at another type of projects, this is us working with city parks in terms of helping them resolve homelessness within our city parks. This is really looking at food and how we could be using parks, which a lot of them are underutilized, as kind of urban farms for the city and providing employment in terms of that. The Braamfontein Spruit, one of the longest longitudinal parks in the world, originally was a spruit, but was canaled in the kind of early 1940s or 1914, and is really pretty much completely transformed in terms of the amount of exotic species and the poor quality of water. Our hero really is this guy, Alfred Mkhize. He's the one who actually started farming technically illegally, because there is no city policy for urban farming in our public parks. And he's the one who gave us the idea around urban farming as a potential program for the site. He's one of these waste recyclers. If you know the Braamfontein Spruit, this is where the site is located, right next to old parks. And so the initial phases of the project are first to kind of do the basics, get rid of invasive species, get rid of litter, and start to restore endemic plant and fish species. Originally, these rivers had about 14 different fish species. Then you've got some issues. You've got homeless people that actually live underneath the bridge. When this river floods, a lot of them have drowned. So bringing a night function to discourage people living underneath the bridge, an art gallery using the students of the nearby Vega Art School's work to exhibit at night. So again, you're putting a function for people to start using using the space at night. And then the urban farming, specifically targeting high price, high quality produce for local restaurants. So you're not trying to compete with your big retail. You're trying to compete from a quality and a price point of view in terms of quite unique plant species that you could sell with that environment. This was this year. Alfred is quite a brave man. He brought his farm back even after he'd been told not to. Unfortunately, shortly after these photos were taken, the police destroyed his farm. So this is, again, the debate around us, and the debate we're having with the city is who is the client of the park. Alfred has lived in the park as a homeless guy for over 30 years, but you have guys who walk their dogs for 30 minutes. Which is the client profile of the park, and what should it be? The name for Park of Light comes from its lighting structure at night, where the lighting system changes color depending on air pollution. Again, trying to say something invisible like air pollution from our vehicles, trying to make that a little bit more visible for people to understand. And then we've got systems that actually treat the water, trying to give the city's water back cleaner than we received it. And then we've got some ideas around how we could provide homeless sleeping pods as a temporary device for these people, which are there because they want to be close to economic opportunities. And then our last project, kind of at a different scale, our elephant migration route project in Limpopo. As we know, elephants are endangered, but in South Africa, we've got an overpopulation of them, and that we have to use culling and Kruger or contraceptive and addo to keep their populations down. And elephants are naturally migratory, almost similar to human beings. We want to move. We don't want to be fenced in. And they're very, very smart. So even electric fences don't keep them at bay. So this project is looking at a 1,000 kilometer migration route for elephants that moves them across the Limpopo province, connecting areas that already have African elephant or are big enough to host them. So everything in the red would be the new routes. If we zoom into that, you've got your big kind of public route, which is linking places like the Waterberg with Madikwe, with the Pilansberg. Where we've implemented our proof of concept is this initial area of privately owned land as a different kind of typology versus publicly owned conservation land. These are kind of the landowners of the area. The two blue are the land properties involved in the project. Ratavi wants elephant, Mabula has elephant that keeps breaking fences. And then the two technologies that we've developed is one is an elephant gate that uses AI camera technology to only allow elephants through a fence line. And then these little circles are infrasonic projections. So elephants use infrasound to communicate to about 4 kilometers. We've worked with musicians to design an infrasonic language to communicate with the animal, to help them, to educate them on how to use this route. And those sounds project to about 2 kilometers. So the idea is to try and rebrand something like the elephant as something that is not just a conservation asset. You know, people are not just coming from all over the world to see a beautiful elephant. Can we rebrand the elephant as it being critical to rural food security? So feeding them things like the marula tree, which is a staple food across the Limpopo province, incredibly high in protein, high in terms of vitamin C, high vitamin C content in oranges. Feeding elephants these kind of fruiting trees, and their natural ecological role is seed dispersal. So, you know, they would be able to plant these seeds as they move. And something like, something like a marula, which is very fast growing at kind of 1.5 meters per year, starts to kind of reestablish these generally degraded rural lands and starts to increase food security. So by 10 years, you've got, a 13, 14 meter tree with the elephants as the gardeners of this specific landscape. And then the interesting thing for us as architects is what happens if you took your mine dumps and regenerated that and allowed that to be the migration route through the city. How would the city have to change if the elephant was considered an equal citizen, had equal rights as we do? And we're not seeing these realms of urban and rural as completely separate but interconnected. If anyone's seen a spectrograph of an elephant call, this is what it looks like. So we as human beings hear to about 20 hertz. What's below 20 hertz is generally called infrasound. And we're just starting to understand all the information that's within this little band of 20 hertz. We understand now that elephants call each other by different names. There's different dialects, language dialects across Africa. The information in there, it will give an elephant the age of the animal, male or female, if they're on heat or not. And again, this is kind of recent, last 20, 30 years, we've started to understand how complex elephant language is. So our elephant acoustic specialist, this incredible musician that did his masters on elephant acoustics, started to spectrograph the local species that use low frequency sound in the area, things like southern ground hornbill, which is a threatened bird species, things like frog species, so that when he designed his language for the elephant, it didn't compete with any kind of ecological sound. And then from an architectural point of view, us studying things like elephant skin, which is kind of designed to crack at a microscopic level. Some clever scientists have translated that into a lattice structure. So what happens is when these cracks happen, elephants fill that with dust and water, and that evaporative cooling is what cools the animal because they don't sweat. So we've been able to translate that into a lattice structure that is a Faraday cage that protects the electronic equipment from lightning, and through evaporative cooling also cools itself. So this is the technology. There's a concrete box at the bottom made out of biomass insulated concrete, which is a net positive embodied carbon material. And this is your big megaphone that transmits the sound. Infrasound kind of uses the ground to crawl. I'm sure you've heard in a thunderstorm, the infrasound actually vibrates your building because it's actually moving through the ground. Your DB and computer equipment that controls your AI system, your CCTV, which is your camera, and obviously everything off the grid when it comes from an energy point of view. And then our skill as architects is really to lead these very diverse professional teams. You've got engineers, elephant acoustic experts, ecologists, elephant behavioral experts, sound experts. This guy in the middle is a crazy German speaker manufacturer that made our infrasonic speaker. So the wonderful thing about being in the built environment is you've got these incredibly diverse professionals, but the skill is in leading them towards a successful product. And our problems are so difficult, so complex. You need a lot of very, very smart different professionals, but you need to lead them in such a way that gets to an overall product, an overall solution. And that's really what I think the real skill of architects is. This is our infrasonic speaker. So again, most speakers obviously are designed for human hearing. We had to design one to play infrasound. And it was so weird standing in front of this where the sound moves through your body. You can't hear it, but you can feel the water in your body vibrating. Kind of a potential for a deadly weapon, in my opinion. And then this was a big breakthrough for us last year where we were able to coordinate the systems that the AI was correctly able to identify what an elephant looks like, open the gate for that specific animal, and the elephant being trained to understand the language in terms of this is now a safe time to use the gate using the infrasound. And at the moment, the project is still training this elephant herd in Limpopo. That's happened the whole of this year with very, very successful outcomes. This is our elephant acoustic expert on-site training elephant. And we finally be able to secure our first potential built project in the Eastern Cape. So being able to scale this from a proof of concept to a real world context is a big deal. This is my last slide, and it's just to, I think, remind us, sometimes we've got an inferiority complex as Africans that we somehow have to just learn from the West and borrow their technologies and drop them here, and then somehow we're competing. And James Suzman, which was an anthropologist that lived with the San for over 10 years, he argues that the most successful people in the world are those that can sustain their civilization over the longest period of time. And if we're taking that definition as success, then the San are the most successful people group in the world. This is their worldview structured on water. So semi-nomadic people, their hunting ground is where they got all their food and medicine from, lived off a plant-rich diet with some meat, but mainly plant-based, about 120 different plant species. They camp completely net zero carbon, completely biodegradable, completely cyclical in terms of how the environment would absorb that. And then they had two spiritual dimensions of sky and underworld that I've superimposed personal dreams and governing authority. So I think just my message to you this morning is to maybe question your own thinking around what are we thinking is inferior when it comes to landscape design? What are we thinking that's not beautiful in terms of landscape design? And how can we approach that really well on our projects? So I've got these three provocations as questions. Where does the aesthetic of what you think makes a beautiful garden come from? Should best practice landscape design be performance instead of aesthetically based? And what role should African cities play in nature conservation? Thanks very much. Marlies, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mark. You can leave those provocations there. Maybe instead of the audience asking you, we can ask the audience to come up with some answers to these and share some experience.
Hi, Mark. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm currently a student. I'm doing my third year in landscape architecture, so it was actually very great to hear your insight and the aesthetic of it, and also breaking down on the different provinces, because I'm originally from Limpopo province, so it was great to hear that input that you gave about the landscape there, which a lot of people never see it as aesthetically pleasing, and you broke it down very well. So I wanted to say thank you so much, and you did very great. I just wanted to answer on the part, I don't know if are we supposed to answer these questions, but on the part that says, should best practice landscape design be performance instead of aesthetically based? I believe that the performance together with it being aesthetically based is actually a great combination that goes well with it. Yes, the performance part is very important, but when it comes to it being aesthetically based, I feel like it's something that a lot of people need to also acknowledge, that it can be beautiful, but also provide an amazing function within any landscape or any site. So my question is, when it comes to that, would you recommend that we mostly apply more performance based or more aesthetically based? Because sometimes most landscape architects, they just want to get a job done and be like, okay, it's a performance well, but it's not as aesthetically pleasing. So I hope maybe you heard me, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just thank you for that question and the encouragement. I'm always worried, I've been brought up in the city. I'm always worried if I go to places like Limpopo, I'm not going to capture the essence of a place as well as I could have. But yeah, your question is very relevant, because the landscaping industry is driven by aesthetics at the moment. So, people care about if it looks pretty, if it's easy to maintain, and that's really where it is. I haven't really seen landscape architects, showcase their projects based on performance. And when I'm talking about performance, I'm talking about, here's the biodiversity that we've brought back. We've monitored, over the last 5 years, and we've seen this thing come back, or this is how many species we've planted, or this is how much carbon the landscape has actually sequestered over time. Because the issue with green buildings now is if you're not using performance metrics, firstly, you can't compare one landscape versus another landscape, like you can't compare one green building versus another green building if they haven't been objectively rated by some kind of, rating scheme that, is best practice. So I think, my excitement is to focus more on the performance side for the landscape architecture industry, because I think it's been missing in green buildings. And I think the Green Building Council, for example, is very much aware of that. And for us to start celebrating, landscapes that are high performance, and to say, guys, well done. You've been, you're not planting 5 species, you're planting over 100 species. That means something from a biodiversity point of view when, as we know, biodiversity breeds biodiversity. If you've got a lot of different plant species that are locally indigenous, that encourages different types of insect species, different types of bird species. So that would be my response. I think just because of where the industry's at, there perhaps needs to be a higher focus on the performance side of landscape design than aesthetics, which, again, aesthetics are subjective, whether you like it or not.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Nina, good to have you here.
Hi. I think it's very important that we must line between aesthetics and performance, because to some extent they are intertwined. Our appreciation of landscape is kind of born in our atavistic impulse of survival in a place with high biodiversity. So when you measure people's appreciation of landscape, they tend to have more appreciation for things that are more highly biodiverse than not. The impact that landscape has on our psychological well-being also has to do with the abundance, etc., of the landscape. So I'm not against the performance. I'm just saying aesthetics is not just about being pretty. It's actually got psychological functions and things like that. On top of this atavistic appreciation, we do have culturally imposed layers, like expectations. So wherever I've traveled in Africa, I've seen people do these incredible topiary, all along the highways. You will have manicured lawns and topiary bushes and so on that are incredibly low performance landscapes, high maintenance, etc. But there's a certain kind of cultural overlay and expectation. In one of my books on natural gardening, the one guy says that when he changed his garden in his suburban American home into a natural garden, on the sidewalk, he kept a 1 meter by 2 meter space of mowed lawn. And he said, as long as he did that, his neighbors were happy. They didn't mind. But if he didn't do that, he's had experience in other places. If he didn't have that one piece of manicured lawn, then they would object, saying that he's not looking after his garden and so on. So I think that example that you showed of that kind of runway of Kukui was a very good one, because we need to draw people into the understanding of natural and wild landscapes from a perspective of, we have appreciation for it, but a lot of people that grow up in urban situations, and I see that now with students a lot, they don't even know what natural landscape in wilderness is. Never mind understanding ecological principles and all that.
I agree. Yeah, I think I've written the question in such a way so it did lead to some debate. There's obviously like you said, a direct overlap, and it is client dependent depending on who you're designing for. So yeah, I agree with what you say.
Thanks, Nina, for sharing that. Paloma?
Hello. So it's not actually Paloma, it's Kate. Kate Ottenheim.
Hi,
But
Kate.
she signed me in, so that's why it says Paloma.
Okay, great.
Hi, Marloes, and hi, Mark. Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Mine isn't sort of an answer, but kind of to say to the questions, but to follow on from what Rebecca was saying. I think that there's a very beautiful book that's just come out called Felt, which is about a landscape. He doesn't call himself a landscaper or an architect. He's a kind of a gardener. Patrick Watson, who I think has been doing the most extraordinary work over long periods. I think he's extremely unknown to a lot of people, but he's done extraordinary work. He's kind of known more for things like The Lost City, when in fact he's kind of restored whole islands in the Seychelles and the likes. So I think that for people here, I just think it's a wonderful reference. You know, whether you buy the book or you don't, I think it's worth a look, and understanding the work that Patrick has done over the years is a wonderful insight into landscape design, I suppose, aesthetics, and how that works in indigenous and endemic environments, and how, as you speak, it kind of creates a whole environment that brings back, you know, animals, birds, etc., that insects that have not been, you know, they've not had suitable environments. So I think that it's just very interesting. But Mark, thank you for a fantastic talk. Really a bit too fast, I have to say, but wonderful.
I know.
Thank you.
My biggest critique, I put too much information, and then I'm like, I want to take things out, but I'd rather have an information overload than underwhelming. But Kate, yeah, I just want to echo your comments on Patrick. For those who don't know him, you know, he was probably the forefather of this whole grassland landscape thing, even within Joburg 30 years, 40 years ago. And that felt book is amazing. And he again, like you mentioned, his knowledge of landscape, which is probably the biggest critique on architecture as well, is because it's such a making discipline. And we learn it in university. He's learned his skill by working with plants and not reading it in some book. That is, you know, some of his landscapes have planted over 600 locally indigenous species. So again, yeah, it's you know, we stand on the giants before us.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Kate, for that addition. I'd love to hear from some landscape architects on the call. Anyone that wants to share some experience or wants to comment on any of these questions? So far, we've only heard from architects. I'd love to hear some from the landscaping side. I also see that Marika has posted another book in the chat box, Sacred Earth Philosophy. I don't know, Marika, if you want to unmute and explain a little bit what that book is about.
Well, it's about what I don't know the book yet because it's a book launch, but I saw it in the newsletter today, and I'm going to try and make it on Saturday because I don't have to be on the farm. So it's about what we did to our landscapes and how the African philosophy can help, and how it was different than the landscape before. And she's written before interesting books. She's a anthropologist originally, I think. So yeah, it's in town, a book launch.
Nice.
Yeah,
thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'll ask some questions.
Yeah, if I may ask a question, just on the, can you, Mark, I mean, it's always also about cost, and the original that landscape you did in Midrand. Do you know? Can you ever give an indication about budget?
Yes. So the good example on the Midrand example is that client is targeting net positive in all 4 of the Green Building Council's categories for an existing building, which has never been done before. Obviously, existing building being much harder. So we found that the net positive ecology was actually the cheapest out of the other 4 categories, being water, waste, and carbon. In terms of that equipment, water actually being the hardest one, which was interesting. So if you're comparing, you know, bang for buck versus other sustainability strategies, landscape is actually pretty cheap. The problem with landscape at the moment is kind of payback periods. If you want to talk financially, you know, obviously there's the biophilia side that science has said, you know, when we're in a more biodiverse environment, we feel healthier. All of that is kind of soft science, where what the work that I'm doing with the University of Cambridge now is, if we can quantify the carbon sequestration potential of a grassland, we could link that to a whole life carbon assessment of a building, which is generally over a 60-year period. that can link to carbon credits. Or if, for what Vermeulen is investigating, is if we could register the grassland that they've put in as a conservation servitude. So that means that when you sell the property in your title deed, any future owner needs to take care of that grassland. So it's kind of protected in perpetuity. So that legal coverage then links you to biodiversity offset schemes internationally. So you could sell that as a biodiversity offset scheme. And as I'm sure many people are familiar, the carbon credit economy is massive and growing. And the next phase is biodiversity offsets that companies will have to start to purchase to offset their biodiversity footprints. So if we can start to link the financial side to the landscape industry, and that's why the performance standards are so important, to say what is best practice, what is not best practice, is what's missing in the industry. Because I think financially, it's actually quite cheap compared to the other. If you're building a building, your landscaping budget is actually quite small. I know that we don't have, generally construction industry is driven by cost. So cost is always a problem. And if I can share a little bit about the Vermeulen landscaping, we've developed a lot of seed mixes now, specifically for Egoli granite grassland. So if you want to put Egoli granite grassland in your landscaping and you found in the northern suburbs, planting seeds is much cheaper than buying plants from nurseries. That is a very cost-effective way to be able to bring these landscapes back. But you do need to know what you're doing, in the sense of, how to maintain a grassland is very different, for obvious reasons, than a Kikuyu lawn. And especially even training the staff to identify what's a weed and what's not a weed in a landscape that has 137 different species is difficult. So I think, as people in the room have said, everyone's on a journey, and the idea is around education without it feeling like we're guilting people into not transforming. But I do think there's this, again, stick and carrot aspect. You need pioneers that are going to be pushing the boundaries and doing things that are radical and should rub people up the wrong way. Like, there should be an aspect of design that feels that way. And then the majority will perhaps look at that and be inspired or reject that. But we do need these kind of two elements of what is best practice and what is pioneering to be able to move us forward.
Okay. Yeah, now we are establishing a permaculture farm in Johannesburg. And indeed, we might have to, if I hear you talking, it's important to measure the baseline before you start to get these credits.
Critical.
And maybe we just start doing without doing that. That's a learning lesson for me then at the moment. Yeah, but interesting.
Thanks. In the absence of more questions from the audience, Marc, you mentioned like these projects, you need to have like quite a number of professionals involved in the design of the landscape. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, who would sort of, like, on a project like the Vermeulen project, I mean, obviously you are super knowledgeable about it because you're interested in it and you gain that knowledge over time. But like, whose role would that sort of be on a project like that if it wasn't the architect?
I think if you're targeting net zero ecology, or even people familiar with Green Star with the V2 now coming in, you're going to have to, it is the landscape architect or landscape designer's responsibility, but you do need to find someone that is interested in indigenous plants, locally indigenous plants, because I think you're going to start to find kind of a specialization now in certain landscape types. Grasslands on its own are so diverse, even high-felt grasslands, they're the second richest primary grasslands in the world. So, I think you're going to see these landscape professionals start to specialize in landscape types. So, like example, in the Fynbos, you've got a lot more critically endangered landscapes than you do in Johannesburg. And you've got nurseries that now are specifically growing plants for specific vegetation types. So your landscape designer is important. We had a landscape designer in-house, so I kind of ran the project management side. Unfortunately, she passed away. So she was a big fan of Patrick Watson and kind of took a lot of pages out of his book in terms of the way he approached grassland design and regeneration. And then we had a grassland expert that supplied us with the plants. A big thing is just, where do you find these plants? And so a lot of our work has been working with the South African National Biodiversity Institute and local indigenous nurseries to start to put plant lists together for our big cities. so that if you again click a button on Ngoli granite grassland, it takes you to a plant list that is from there. We've developed that data now that people on the call want access to that. I'm happy to provide those links so that people just start to engage in in my garden what used to be here, and then it can be aesthetically based, and this looks like a beautiful plant I want to try out, or it's a locally based food plant. So yeah, landscape architect's important. We had an ecologist just review the submission and sign off just to check everyone from an objective point of view, but he didn't really cost much. And then obviously having a net zero AP is a minimum requirement once you do these ratings. But that can also be the landscape designer. So some of the work, if they're landscape designers or architects in the building and they're wanting to kind of upskill themselves on landscape regeneration, I've done a short course through the University of Minnesota in the States that allows me to become a professional with the Society of Ecological Restoration, which is probably the global leader around best practice when it comes to regeneration of landscapes. So I'm also happy to share that course. That's a relatively affordable course to do, and it goes into the detail of like how do you design a seed mix, the basics of landscape restoration, which again I wasn't really exposed to when I did my architectural studies. So it's not actually that professional heavy. I think if you've got a good landscape designer, you should be fine.
I just want to follow up, for example, in Johannesburg, would it then mean that we can't really plant trees anymore? Because as I understand, trees are not necessarily endemic to the Joburg area.
So that's a great debate. So there's very different views. At the moment, if you take the trees of Johannesburg, it's such a big forest that it's changed the species profile of the city. So you have species now coming to breed, locally indigenous bird species like red-chested cuckoo coming to breed in our forest, where they would never have bred here if the city wasn't here. So there's an element in which now you do have a kind of a functional ecological system that I think would be a mistake to just cut down all the trees. But there perhaps needs to be intelligence on, if you are going to plant trees, that we plant locally indigenous species, which there are some that, because we've changed the climate and it's a little bit warmer, would survive. But as you've mentioned, grasslands were typically treeless. You do have a couple of trees like Protea capra, which is the one that you saw in the Alexandra Township example, specifically adapted to fire and can survive the cold. But yeah, trees are good in the sense of, they provide some kind of habitat for birds. They provide urban heat island reduction, but they do take a lot of water. They do take a lot of space. Sometimes they're pushing over your boundary wall. So I think it probably needs to be quite site specific. And that's how I think the V2 Green Star rating has been written. The drive should be how can I get the highest biodiversity possible on my site? And if the trees are helping that and supporting that, then great. Sometimes you do have an invasive tree that you need to get rid of, and sometimes that is the best thing for the site itself. But I think if we're using biodiversity as our metric and saying overall, how do we get the greatest amount of biodiversity, then that should hopefully decide if we keep the trees or not. Generally, in my sites, I try and keep trees if they're not invasive, if they're not going to be spreading their seed and taking over, then I generally keep them.
Yeah, and I mean, that's super important for shade as well and creating comfortable environments.
Exactly.
There's a question from Amy. How long does it take a grassland to grow from scratch?
Oh, that's such a good question, Amy. So a grassland has 3 phases. It's got its pioneer phase. So these are plants that come in on bare ground. They come up really quickly. They're there to stabilize the soil, make sure that, the topsoil is not getting blown away or washed away. They generally annuals, which means that they come up from seed and then they die. And the next phase is subclimax, where you've got plants that are semi-perennial. So maybe they'll last 1 or 3 years and then disappear. And then the final one is called climax, which is your kind of most biodiverse grassland. You've got species that some people say an established perennial grass could be 1,000 years old, because it doesn't necessarily form on seed. It forms with rhizomes underneath the ground. And you've got a central plant that gets burnt and cut, and then there's a new ring of rhizomes, a new ring of rhizomes. So there's some botanists that say that some grasses, if you go to places like the Drakensberg or the Lesotho Mountains, where they haven't been completely destroyed, a grass could be 1,000 years old. But to answer your question, the pioneering stage, what we try and do in landscape design is kind of speed that process up. So the pioneering stage is generally your first year. So specifically in the seed mixes that we've designed for ecological grassland, and let's say you're starting your grassland, that first year, it's critical to choose the right species that come up quickly, stabilize the soil. It's basically, you think about it like an operation. You go to the doctor, you're being cut open. That's what happens when you remove the vegetation from the soil. The bacteria is going to die, the fungi is going to die, it's drying out. You want to try and cover that soil layer as quickly as possible. And then your subclimax takes about 3 to 5 years to establish. And then about 10 years, you will start to see the perennials establishing themselves and asserting dominance depending on where they've been planted. But obviously the debate around grasslands and biodiversity, especially in what's happening in the United States, is those grasslands, if you want to compare them to the original state, some people say it's impossible. Some people say it takes about 100 years for those grasslands to reestablish. And the reason for that is because of the soil biome. About 60% of the magic of grasslands is happening below the soil surface. And it's these relationships between fungi and between bacteria, between the plant. They're all exchanging nutrients in this wonderful symbiotic way. And when we, for example, farm the land and till the land, or if we've destroyed it from an urban point of view, to rebuild those systems is very, very difficult. So there's a lot of work at the moment happening in academia in terms of how we do that, because obviously the higher biodiversity climax grasslands sequester the most amount of carbon. So I hope that answers your question, but we're looking at around a 10-year establishment time if you want to talk about a grassland now being considered, okay, it's at its climax stage.
Great. I think there's a follow-up question in the chat around carbon sequestration. Do we have any experts in South Africa that can measure this, or to measure the carbon sequestration of the landscapes over a lifespan, especially since carbon would be stored over time, so it can't be determined at installation or even within a year of establishment? Can you elaborate? Do you know this? Do you know anything about this? And can you elaborate on that?
Cool. So that's my master's dissertation topic through the University of Cambridge. So my focus is on urban grasslands, which hasn't been studied before. So the studies that we've done before have been on obviously indigenous grasslands. We know, for example, in the Drakensberg, how much carbon is within those soils. Most of our carbon as a country is stored in the grassland and the savanna biome in our soils. So that's where most of our land sink is. Most of the studies are being done on farmland, so transforming, monocultural, let's say maize, we're transferring that to a grassland. But remember that farming is maybe planting 3 or 4, plant species, and they're specifically designed for cattle fodder. So it's food for cattle. But there have been 10, 20, 30-year studies on carbon sequestration that show that, for example, if you choose between doing a grassland or doing a monocultural annual crop like maize, the grassland sequesters way more than the crop does. So that's why, again, you're seeing a move in farmland that happening. But the research within cities is unknown. So especially because we got such a biodiverse grassland, biome, being high-felt grassland, the excitement of what we're doing with Munich is we're taking about 60 soil samples across the site and measuring carbon sequestration as the landscape is at the moment as a baseline. It's still young, kind of 2 years. But then there are calculations around how to project that carbon that have been done in South Africa. So the idea for my dissertation is to take that baseline, or maybe see if there is higher or lower carbon compared to a kikuyu lawn, there is still a kikuyu lawn on site, and measure that difference, and then to project that over a 60-year period. And again, then we can tie landscaping into the move now in buildings is to look at whole life carbon assessments. So to look at the carbon emissions across a building's lifespan, from the materials that are made in the building, the mining, to the transport, to construction, to operations, to the demolishing of the building. And generally that timeline is measured as about 60 years. We can start to put landscapes now and saying, if you're planting a grassland landscape, this is potentially the amount of carbon you could sequester. And I think it gives landscape architects a great weapon to justify locally indigenous planting when you're saying you're linking it to, the whole life carbon assessment of a building. I think that's a wonderful link that potentially could really scale these types of landscapes, across buildings and across cities. I hope that answers the question, Marlies.
I think it did, and more. So last question, and then we have to wrap up our webinar. With urban farming, are there any specific methods or ways you would suggest or think in terms of tackling the issue of space and soil issues?
Yeah, so urban farming with that City Parks project, we actually had an urban farming expert just help us again define that strategy of, for example, the high value, high price, high quality produce. The debate with the city is they don't want to lose any land, so they argue that river, with all its degraded water, is a critical biodiversity area for spotted-necked otter, which in my lifetime I've never seen in the city of Johannesburg. There's this, I think City Parks, for example, there is a bit of an identity crisis in terms of them, do they deal with social issues like homelessness, or do they ignore that and they're only an environmental organization that cuts the grass? I think that's been the struggle with justifying urban farming. The other approach that we've suggested for them was to do a greenhouse so that it doesn't touch the land. But urban farming is still there doesn't seem to be a clear vision for the city on from a policy point of view, what is allowable and what is not. Obviously, there's issues with what we've seen in our parks in Joburg of invasions. They're worried about people building permanent structures. But at the same time, there's a lack of use for a lot of our parks, that they're just, again, these ideas of these open European gardens where we've got 40% homeless, 40% unemployment. You're going to have people living there. It's just inevitable, and I don't think that problem is going to go away overnight. So I think we need to be smarter with the land that we do have to create these microeconomic systems that, again, can bring the excitement of that project is that you're bringing a wealthy suburb of Craighall, a middle class suburb of Randburg, and kind of the most vulnerable of our city, which are arguably people living in parks. They're not even living in formal settlements. They're living in parks without any kind of formal support, and trying to build a microeconomic system that provides services for all three of those people groups in a way that they can appreciate them living in the same space. And I think for me, that's the definition of what democratic architecture or democratic design is taking something like urban farming and making it work as an economic system. I think is the missing link for urban farming to scale. But again, I think it's a speciality that I would love landscape architects to invest a lot more time and energy, and I'm sure that is happening behind the scenes or within academic environments. But I'd love to see projects pushing our policies to the limit and saying, is this a relevant policy for us or not? I think there's a space for those kind of pilot projects, perhaps even within an academic space. So hopefully, maybe even people in this room can think about that within their university institutions.
Great, thanks for that, Marc. There's 2 more questions in the chat box, and maybe you can, in the last couple of minutes, answer them in the chat while I'm wrapping up.
Okay. Is this Elizabeth, Davids, and Yaron?
Yes,
Are those the
exactly.
questions? Okay.
I would love
What are
to
your
hear the
thoughts?
answer to the vertical plants and green walls.
Vertical walls. The headaches. So this is very personal, so don't take this as some kind of truth, gospel truth. I stay away from green walls. The problems that I found is just the lack of irrigation. So if you think about a grassland, it's like a sponge. It's there to absorb water, to absorb storm water, and then release it very, very slowly. You just don't get enough water if you're looking at a grassland as a vertical wall for that thing to be sustainable. I've seen one successful one, I'm sure many of you have, on Keys Art Mile, that was designed, very, very closely with some of the best grassland experts. Johan Wetzel's was part of that. I think Studio Mass, was part of that. So you need some really very, very, smart people behind you from a team support, and then the maintenance again. So you've got these little pockets of soil. They have to get enough water. They're on a wall, so they're getting smacked with a whole bunch of light. I'd prefer, angling a wall, getting a 45-degree and putting your soil on top of that, and I think that would be better in the long term. But I wouldn't stop anyone attempting a green wall. I think I haven't seen a successful piece of technology that makes me confident to say to a client, let's do a green wall. I would prefer a green roof where I can control stormwater and make sure that soil stays moist is important. If the soil dries out, it's problematic.
And I think that's specifically relevant for the Joburg climate. I mean, Durban would be a completely different situation. So next events, next webinars, next month, we're going to talk about crafting a natural home. We're going to showcase a home built in Limpopo, mainly with earth and timber. And we're also talking about the natural paints they used. So that's going to be a nice one. It's already open for registration, so you can sign up. In October, we're talking about upcycling and transforming waste into value. And we're going to showcase a project in Cape Town that's built with completely reused materials. And then in November, we're going to have a 5-year webinar special. And there's going to be some excitement. We're going to invite some speakers back and see where they are and where they have gone over the years. And we're going to also have some unexpected prizes. For example, for the person that has registered for the most webinars. And I saw the person is on this webinar. So some excitement in November. So keep that in your diary, always the last Thursday of the month. Oh, here's the slide about the anniversary webinar in November. We're going to share some of our history over the last couple of years, what we've done with the Regenerative Collaborative, and and hoping to inspire you to follow us even more in the coming years to come. And then I'm going to take this opportunity to also promote a green building course. If you want to learn first principles about green buildings, it's basically Green Buildings 101. We have a 3-day CPD validated course, which we're hosting again. We did one 2 weeks ago, which was very successful. And we're doing another one from the 16th to the 18th of October. The course is developed by IFC Edge and hosted by Greenet. So if you are interested, just let me know, drop me an email or drop an email to admin@greenet.co.za. And yeah, I can definitely recommend the course. And then big thank you to Marc today and John, who wasn't able to make it today. But thanks, Marc, for stepping in and taking over the show for today. Even though you spoke so fast, it was so much information, such great projects. And which brings me to my last question that I was going to ask: where can we follow you? Where can we find the updates of these projects? Because I remember you speaking about the elephants last year, and I have no idea how far you were in that project already. So that's awesome. Where can we find you and your projects?
Yeah, so you can follow us on all the kind of big social media stuff. So we're on Facebook. Marc Sherratt Sustainability Architects on LinkedIn. Instagram is for kind of our younger audience. That's more, we're taking photos of projects on site and on what's happening. So we try and curate, for each audience that we're targeting on social media. So you won't get the same stuff if you follow us on different platforms. But yeah, I think start there. And if people also want to drop me an email and they've got specific questions as I wasn't able to answer in this session, let me know. I'll drop my email in the chat.
Great, thanks. And earlier we did drop your LinkedIn page. Yeah, and then lastly, if you know somebody that wants to become a sponsor of our webinars, that goes towards the cost of validating these webinars for CPD points. And you know where to find us on social media. And with that, I'm going to call it to a close. Thank you for attending. Really appreciate you attending our webinars. And again, to Marc, much appreciated for your sharing your story. And have a good evening, everyone. And thank you for your questions and participation. Love to see you next month again.